Chen, Managing Director of Shenzhen Valley Ventures. It's a pleasure to have you here talking about hardware today.
Thank you.
To dive right in, Tim, when we look at the hardware landscape, we see that a lot of venture capitalists, a lot of entrepreneurs really aren't willing to spend their time, their energy, and their resources on hardware. For you, what makes sense about hardware?
Well, we live in a physical world. There's only so much that software can do before it translates into offline success. And we're seeing proliferation of many products around AR, VR. We're seeing robotics. We're seeing a lot of intelligent devices being the next part in the next generation of your life. And you're seeing all these companies actually build fledgling businesses that want to be the next Xiaomi to make a hardware a part of your daily life.
That's interesting. So when you think about some of the new practices in hardware manufacturing, when we think about rapid prototyping, small batch manufacturing, design for manufacturing, how have these lowered the barriers to entry into the market, and how are they helping young companies get to a viable product?
Yeah, these concepts have been around for ages, for tens of years. But it's really translated in terms of where the expertise is located. Previously, the Western world were the experts. They made the best products, they had the best talent, and they had the best engineers. But that gravitational pull has shifted to Asia over the last 30 years, where 80 to 90% of all products are made in Asia today. And the reason is that the expertise is there today. So to be able to do this in the Bay Area or even just Pan America, it becomes much harder to do because you don't have the right expertise.
That's really interesting. So say a little bit more about how shortening the feedback loops between early market experience and product iteration, how have they helped these companies be more successful and the money associated with them be more successful as well?
Sure. To be able to get a product done here, you have to really find the right expertise. You have to actually either go hire them, so you have to go hire a mechanical person, you have to hire electrical, you have to supply chain, firmware, you have to build all these expertise around you. And by the time you finish hiring your team, it's 10 to 15 very specialty experts who hopefully has the capability to execute. And if they haven't worked in Asia over the last few years, they probably haven't kept up with the innovations of manufacturing. And that's always a very large risk. So if you do take that risk, you're gonna have to raise $10+ million to support the senior team, and you have to get it right the first time. But if you think about a lot of these skill sets that we just talked about, they're commodities. They're commoditized, and if you don't have the right machinery downstairs, if you don't have the right supply chain experts, then you're not tapping into what is actually gonna help you build a real product. But instead, what we advise is that startups should focus on the things that they do best, that differentiate them, such as you have to focus on your software, you have to focus on the intelligence of your product, focus on user experience, focus on industrial design, focus on the consumer or the industrial experience that is gonna make your product different and how you're gonna make that leading edge, and focus on how to distribute a product. Because once you build a product and a product comes off of the line, you better find a home for it because you can't stack it all in your warehouse.
So given that nice list of success factors, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see among hardware startups, and how do you think about those?
Yeah, we see hardware startups actually trying to raise too much money because they think they need a lot of money to execute, and they take too much time. Because trying to be too perfect on a product is a death knell for almost any startup out there. Because once you build a perfect product, somebody's gonna copy it, and you have to build a next perfect product. So what we advise is that a hardware company goes and actually prototypes what their basic beliefs are, test that rigorously to make sure that they are building something that consumers want or the industry wants. And then afterwards, enter the DFM process, the design for manufacturing process, as early as possible, because then you can actually validate your assumptions through the supply chain, and then you can actually see what's available to actually build your product, because it may be very different than what you think is available through your typical mail order process to get your prototype parts out. So once you go through that design process, it's an engineering validation test, design validation test, and your production validation test. So during the engineering phase, you're actually building that product with supply chain in mind. Not every factory out there or not every supplier out there actually wants to work with you, because at that point you're too small. You have to take what you have, build that product, make sure it's reliable, because if it's not, your products are getting sent back to you and your company is done.
So does that mean that supply chain acts as a constraint on innovation?
It absolutely does, because you don't have the same materials or the same access as Apple does. You can't be Apple from day one. They customize their processes where they can actually wield power by ordering millions upon millions upon millions of products at once. People take them seriously. They will customize themselves for you. But if you're an entrepreneur, you need tens, if not thousands of products, and you're ordering that off of somebody else's supply chain. That has to be made before. So supply chain is very important when building a product.
That's interesting. So if we think for a moment about crowdfunding platforms and how they function in a couple of ways broadly, where we think about them as a validation point for customer traction and consumer adoption.
Right.
And if we also think about them as front-loading revenue in early stage hardware startups, how have that combined with lowering the barriers to market entry? How has that functioned to make a diverse set of innovative hardware startups possible?
Yeah, crowdfunding resources are great in terms of validating, do consumers want your product? Do they see the sexiness or the appeal of your product? But without having touched one, without having actually experienced one, there's still a gap in terms of what this needs to be. So you need to close that gap as an entrepreneur as soon as possible with the least amount of resources as possible. So don't hire a team out. Make sure that you can actually get your first EV products out to these people so that people can actually test it. Because once you hit that DV or design validation test, then you start lowering the cost of each product, and you can actually ship the first few hundred out to your early backers after you tool. And once you do that, you know whether you have something or whether you have nothing. Spend the least amount of money, spend the least amount of time to actually get there, and then use your early crowdfunding as a channel for success because you want those people to love what you do. If you don't, it's okay because you haven't shipped market product yet. At that time, you need to build a distribution chain because once the products come off the line at market product or MP, you don't get a chance to actually reel that back again. You have to find homes for those products.
No, I think it's a really interesting point because we've seen some very intelligent companies and very intelligent people have difficulties in the market.
Right.
Juicero, Rethink Robotics, Jibo.
Right.
And so if we recognize for the moment that crowdfunding success is not indicative of a sticky consumer relationship, what do you find in common among those high-profile difficulties, and how should they have thought differently? What were some of the common mistakes they made?
Let's look at this from a ventures perspective, right? If any of those companies came out, they sold $5 million worth of product, and their valuation was $20 to $30 million, they'd be an overnight success. Somebody would be lining up to fund them. But when their valuation is 200 to 300 million, they're expected to sell $100 million worth of products and be robust. When you introduce a new product out there, someone's always going to love it, and then you're going to have the majority of the population who are in that wait and see approach. So it takes time to get there. So if they can actually get that initial attraction very early, they can plan how they can actually get that second iteration, which is better than the first iteration. And if you raise on a $20 million to $30 million valuation, it's much more appetizing than if you hit $300 million because your expectations are so high that if you miss one step, your company's done.
So these companies, they have really smart people working in them. How did investor expectations become so misaligned with production and market estimates?
There's always the old saying that if you build it, they'll come, right? If you build a first generation iPod, if you build a first iPhone, there's going to be mass penetration. Think about how many products Apple failed with and survived before they actually got to the iPod or the iPhone. There were years where they built a Newton and it wasn't the next great success, but they survived. Build something fast, don't spend too much money on it, and survive. And once you survive, you're going to iterate until you get to build a better product. You build that consumer base who love you, and you differentiate by your consumer experience, you differentiate by your product support, and the novelty of what a startup stands for. And once you do that, people will love you again.
So as we kind of drive those iterations back early into first product design and going from first product to kind of first revenue, not quite to scale yet, that's where you're advising that companies should make their mistakes as quickly as they can.
Right, make your mistakes, and then go through a DFM process, a proper DFM process, because last thing you want to do is have product recalled back to you, because that's just good for nobody. Because retailers are not going to suffer the hit because of it. It's all on your company. And that's when you're in a death spiral to have your company crash.
Returns are revenue prevention.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about incentive structures. When we think about these companies working really hard to build extremely robust projects, on the key at the same time trying to maintain margins. How are the practices we're seeing in early manufacturing and small batch? How are they affecting those relationships?
Yeah, when you're an entrepreneur, you come up with an idea, you come up with your first build. Everybody's going to tell you have the greatest thing in the world, but when you go to scale this, when you go to a factory, go to a contract manufacturer, they're thinking very differently. They're thinking about what their incentive is to actually build a product. If you have just a few hundred orders, they're not going to take the time to actually build up a line for you, make the product, and then disassemble the line within a couple of weeks. It's not the business model for them. They want order volumes of a few million units so that they can actually produce that and extract margin off of it. Now, that's why it's very different than what's called a DFM process, because once you go through a DFM process, your interests are protected because you're building a good product at that time, and then you actually bid it out to contract manufacturers. And it buys you time to actually build an excellent product along the way.
Interesting. So, as kind of a final cap in our conversation, I'm going to ask you to talk about some of the trends you see coming over the next year or two in the hardware space.
Sure.
But in particular, I want to throw a couple of things at you. I'd like to see you talk about hardware 2.0.
Okay.
I'd like to see when we talk about AR and VR and we talk about layering the complexity of AI into product manufacture, how will these trends affect that? And how will they affect the producibility and the profitability of early products?
Building a good product is essentially a key component of every successful company. So to be able to do that, you have to work in teams because you're not going to be able to actually do everything under your house. You're not going to be able to do everything under your roof. And the ones that have done that have rarely became the massive successes that they want to be. So start dividing and conquering. The commodities, mechanical, electrical, whether it's PCBs, whether it's actually supply chain, let the experts handle those things. Start really differentiating and iterating on your AI, on your experience, and on your distribution mechanisms so that you can actually scale your business. Because when you deal with anything that has a hardware component about it, if you don't deliver this in terms of mass reach, then your business is gone after a little while.
Do you find in layering AI and content manufacture on top of the production process, do you find AI as a service out there? Do you find content as a service? Or are people homegrowing these?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing AI as a service for a lot of companies because they're focusing on the AI, they're partnering with others to actually build a hardware, and then combine, they're able to actually put out a product, and it's actually starting to affect the whole industry because the best AI talent is in certain regional pockets around the world. And China is actually starting to catch up in that as well. So to be able to differentiate, you got to stay ahead of that race. When you build a physical product plus AI, just know that you can't do it all. But when you put everything together and you work with the right partners, it makes things happen and it gets you to market faster.
So what other trends are exciting you today?
We love what's happening in robotics because motors are actually coming down in terms of cost. And we're seeing a lot of AI products out there that are building novel ways to do the same old approach, but really just doing it autonomously.
Nice.
Costs are coming down, acuity is actually going up, and all of the AR, VR that's happening today, I think is just a very small footprint in terms of what this industry might be.
Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Tim Chen, Managing Director of Shenzhen Valley Ventures. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much.